Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. Other Worlds, Other Gods, Adventures in Religious Science Fiction. Edited by Mayo, Mohs, published 1971. This is the New English Library hardback edition that I just read, published in 1975. So this is an anthology of short stories on a theme of religion in science fiction. So there are 12 stories in here, as well as one poem, and these stories date from 1942 to 1969. So let's take a look at the story list. There they are. As you can see, there are quite a few well-known names on this list, well-known authors. Some of these stories are definitely better than others, just like any short story collection, really. But on the whole, it's a pretty solid list, I think. And there are a few absolute bangers in here. All of these stories have something to offer. They've got interesting themes, and they're all thought-provoking in their own way. So, let's take a brief look at each of these stories in turn. Now, the first story is called The Cunning of the Beast by Nelson Bond, who's not an author that I'm familiar with. Anyway, this is a kind of sci-fi retelling of the Adam and Eve story from the Bible. So we've got a protagonist who's an individual from a godlike race who live in giant domes on an alien planet. And he decides to create intelligent life to serve him in his garden dome. It's a kind of vainglorious experiment. Okay? So he's quite reminiscent of Victor Frankenstein in some ways. Anyway, as you can imagine, it's not long before things start to go wrong. Things go pretty pear-shaped. I really enjoyed this story. It's entertaining, but it's also quite provocative because of its portrayal of God, right? Or at least this guy who is acting as God. He's a very flawed being. He's arrogant, he's self-serving, and myopic. And the next story is called Across of Centuries by Henry Kuttner. And in this story, we follow an immortal being who has lived for thousands of years. And at some point in the past, he somehow liberated humankind from violence and sin, and is now worshipped as a kind of messiah. Okay. But despite having an immortal body, his mind is not free from the effects of aging. So every century he has to renew himself, and he has to have his memories wiped clean. So he undergoes this kind of mental renewal that changes him in such a way that becomes like a new persona every time this happens. His personality changes slightly. In a way, it kind of reminds me of the concept of Time Lord regeneration in Doctor Who. But not quite as dramatic as that, but still. Anyway, this one is quite tragic in tone. Not a bad concept, but it did feel a bit lacking in depth. This is followed by Soulmate by Lee Sutton, which is a story on the theme of telepathy. So we have two strangers, a man and a woman, who meet on a train, and then they become telepathically linked with one another. So they can read each other's thoughts and vicariously live each other's experiences. And this link becomes permanent. It never goes away. much to the chagrin of the main character, who is the man in the story. These two people have a real clash of personalities, but they're forced to live in each other's minds. The female character is a practicing Catholic, whereas the male POV character is a strident atheist. So they become kind of unwilling soulmates, hence the title. And that's what drives the conflict in this story. So it's quite an interesting idea, but I did find the protagonist very unlikable and chauvinistic. This is not because of his atheism. It's more because he's quite misogynistic. But still, it's not a bad story. Now, the next one is The Word to Space by Winston P. Sanders. I later found out that Winston P. Sanders is a pen name for Paul Anderson. So this story imagines a first contact scenario in which humanity picks up messages from a distant planet 25 light years away. These messages, once decoded, are revealed to contain religious propaganda from a totalitarian civilization. So this story looks at the social and religious effects that these messages are having on Earth and the human response to these messages. So it's a decent enough story, but it's written in quite a dry way. So it's not bad, but it's nothing earth-shattering. And the next story is Prometheus by Philip José Farmer. This is a longer story. It's more of a novella, really. I really enjoyed this one. The protagonist in Prometheus is a travelling monk called Father John Carmody, who's featured in a few of Farmer's other stories. But this is the first story I've read featuring him. So we learned that in a previous episode, before this story takes place, this character was attacked by a rare bird-like species whose egg has been parasitically attached to his chest. And that's where the story takes off. Now, I've not read the previous story, but I don't think it really matters because this particular story works fine as a standalone. Anyway, so Father John, in order to see what can be done about the egg, he travels to the bird's homeworld on another planet, and there he learns more about their species, who are called the Horowitz, and they turn out to be remarkably intelligent. And while they lack the trappings of civilization, they are clearly sentient and have the potential for such. So as he spends more and more time with these beings and they earn his trust, religious and philosophical questions come into play, such as what is the purpose of these beings in God's creation? Do they have souls? Is there an afterlife? And things like that. So I think this is a fantastic story, possibly even my favourite in this collection, with some very intriguing world building. And it makes me want to seek out the rest of the Father John Carmody stories that Philip José Farmer wrote. Okay, this is followed by The 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur C. Clarke, which is an absolute classic and possibly the most famous story in here. I've read it a couple of times before. So this one is set in a Tibetan monastery, and it concerns a group of monks who have hired the use of modern technology to complete and fulfill an age-old mystical quest to list all of the names of God. So this story is only a few pages long, but I think it's a very haunting and profound tale. and it perfectly explores the intersection between technology and faith. And it's got a very memorable ending and final line. Next up is The Vitanuls by John Brunner. And that's another amazing one. 3 5-star stories in a row. So, this is a story on the theme of overpopulation and dharmic cosmology. Okay, so it's focused more on the kind of Hindu worldview, specifically the concept of the transmigration of souls. So this story is set in an Indian maternity ward, and it explores what happens when the world population grows so much it reaches a point where there are more people alive today than have ever existed throughout the whole of human history, and the devastating spiritual consequences that follow for humanity once we reach that critical moment. So, without wishing to spoil what happens, I won't say any more than that, but I'll just tell you that this was a really chilling, memorable idea that Brunner came up with. And this story enters sci-fi horror territory, okay? So it's well worth a read. Okay, this is followed by Judas. It's another John Brunner story. Okay, I have read this one previously in Dangerous Visions, the Harlan Ellison anthology. There are actually 3 stories from Dangerous Visions in here in this collection, and they're all really short, no more than 10 pages each. Now, I didn't personally have a great experience with Dangerous Visions as an anthology, but this particular John Brunner story, Judas, it's not bad actually. I quite enjoyed this one. It's a kind of allegorical take on the figure of Judas in the Bible, and it's set in a robot worshipping society of the future. It's quite provocative in tone in terms of its religious themes and its ideas. So quite a good story, I think, but nowhere near as powerful or chilling as the previous Brunner story, which I just talked about, in my opinion. Right, and this brings us on to the 2 stories by Anthony Boucher. Okay, another author who I'd not heard of before. The first one is called The Quest for Saint Aquin, and this is set in a future post-apocalyptic world in which religion has been banned, and we follow an undercover Catholic priest who's been sent on a secret quest to find the lost tomb of a saint. It's got some very intriguing world building in this one, with some definite Canticle for Leibowitz vibes, and a nice little twist ending to boot. So it's a pretty good story. The second Boucher story that follows this is called Balaam. This is a kind of first contact story of a sort, featuring a rabbi and another Catholic priest who come into contact with an aggressive alien species on Mars. Now, this one didn't really leave much of an impression on me. I think it's a kind of sci-fi retelling of the story of Balaam, who was a prophet in the Old Testament. So maybe if you're familiar with that biblical story, you'll get more out of it. But I found this one kind of dull. Okay, and this brings us on to Evensong by Lester del Rey. This is quite an interesting take on the creation myth, the death of God, and mankind usurping God's power. Quite a provocative concept. Again, this is another Dangerous Vision story, but it's a very short story, and it's more of an allegory than a proper story, really. And this is followed by Shall the Dust Praise Thee by Damon Knight. which is also from Dangerous Visions. This one's really short. It's just 5 pages long. And again, it's got quite a fable-like quality to it. In this case, God arrives on Earth on Judgment Day, only to find humanity has already wiped itself out. Now, this story didn't really do that much for me, but it does have a great final line, which is quite memorable and provocative. And finally, this collection is rounded off with not a story, but a poem called Christus Apollo by Ray Bradbury. It's actually an extract from a poem rather than the complete text. So this poem muses on the possibility of divine revelation taking place in other parts of the galaxy, and the story of Christ repeating itself on far-off planets. So yeah, those are all the stories. It's a decent anthology. I really enjoyed it. There were 4 stories in here in particular that I loved. And the rest were all good, or at least okay. And there was nothing in here that was poor. So on the whole, I think this is a really good collection. And even though those stories which I loved only account for 4 out of 13, proportionally, they take up quite a large chunk of this book, right? Because of the differences in page length in the stories. I did a bit of maths, okay, and I calculated that those 4 stories amount to 120 pages. And that's out of about 250 pages of text in this book. So that's almost half the content. So with that in mind, I'm really glad I decided to read this, and I'm going to give Other Worlds, Other Gods as a whole a rating of 4 stars. It's a great anthology, and if you're at all interested in religious themes and science fiction, highly recommended. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon for some more sci-fi content.